Howdy, students. Our survey of climate history now brings us into the 2000s. In the Kyoto Protocol, rich, developed countries agreed to reduce emissions averaged over the 2008 to 2012 commitment period by about 5% below 1990's baseline emissions. That meant that, after 2012, there would be no international agreement in place limiting greenhouse gas emissions. So by the mid-2000s, people started thinking about what a follow-on to the Kyoto Protocol would look like. The world met in Copenhagen in 2009 to hammer out just such an agreement. People were optimistic because Barack Obama had just taken over the U.S. presidency and, unlike George W. Bush, he was extremely interested in getting an international agreement to reduce emissions in place. However, success at Copenhagen was elusive. The main roadblock was a disagreement between rich developed nations and those that were still poor. Remember, when George W. Bush pulled the U.S. out of the Kyoto Protocol, one of his main objections was that the agreement was unfair because developing country emissions were not covered. So the rich world insisted that poor countries make some agreement to reduce emissions at the outset. The argument for this was not completely unreasonable. Many countries categorized as developing, like China, are major economic competitors in many markets, and it was felt that allowing them unfettered emissions would disadvantage the rich world. And while the rich world is responsible for most of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere today, future emissions will be dominated by countries that are poor today, like China and India. So any agreement that did not include them would be missing a large fraction of future emissions. Poorer countries, on the other hand, argued that it was only fair that countries that were primarily responsible for climate change today, the rich countries, should take the lead. Poorer countries would then take action to reduce emissions after the rich world had actually started reducing their emissions. This is the rationale behind the Framework Convention's common but differentiated responsibilities. At the last minute, an agreement was drafted in Copenhagen by an ad hoc group of nations led by Barack Obama. This agreement, called the Copenhagen Accord, contains several important points. If you remember back to our discussion of the Framework Convention, I talked about how one of the goals set there was to avoid dangerous human influence on the climate system. However, the Framework Convention did not define dangerous. The Copenhagen Accord, however, defined dangerous global warming as warming greater than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level. The Copenhagen Accord also partly mapped out the long-term emissions targets in pursuit of that goal. The Accord said that emissions should peak as soon as possible and decline thereafter. There should be a 50% reduction in emissions by 2050 globally relative to 1990 emissions. For rich developed countries, the emissions reduction should be at least 80%. However, important deficiencies remain. The most significant was that there was a lack of detail on how these total emissions reductions translated into emission limits for each country. Overall, the Copenhagen Accord was considered a poor showing that accomplished little in the primary task of getting a follow-on agreement for the Kyoto Protocol. Following the disappointment of the 2009 Copenhagen meeting, advocates of stronger action developed a new approach. Instead of the Kyoto Protocol's approach of negotiating a particular limit on emissions for each country, the next agreement would ask each country to state what they would do to reduce emissions. So, for example, the U.S. volunteered to reduce emissions by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025, and to make best efforts to reduce by 28%. China agreed to limit their emissions, pledging for emissions to peak in 2030. These national statements of intended action were known as the Intended Nationally Determined Contribution, or INDCs. All countries submitted INDCs. Overall, major industrialized countries stated emissions targets substantially stronger than their previous ones. Even more promising were strong statements from developing countries like China, including the first unconditional targets for total emissions. The world had agreed at the Copenhagen meeting in 2009 to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius to avoid dangerous climate change. At the Paris negotiations, the definition of dangerous was lowered to well below 2 degrees Celsius, while pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The country's INDC pledges became the basis of the Paris Agreement. It is important to realize that the Paris Agreement was only the first step of the process of stabilizing the climate. If fully achieved, the pledges made would reduce warming in 2100 from 4.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial under baseline emissions growth to about 3.5 degrees Celsius, falling well short of achieving even the weaker 2 degrees Celsius target. Despite this, the Paris Agreement was considered a success. It was the first time that all countries in the world agreed to reduce emissions. There was predictable pushback from Republicans in the U.S. Perhaps unsurprisingly, therefore, President Trump campaigned on withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, and once in office, he started the process to withdraw. He claimed that the agreement is unfair to the United States, but that agreement doesn't actually make any sense. The goal for each country is set by that country. If the new administration believed that the goal Obama agreed to was too onerous, they could have simply weakened the goal and stayed in the agreement. But it's clear that this was a lot more than about climate change. It was really a policy that allowed Trump to shore up his base. The withdrawal allowed Trump to tear down one of Obama's signature agreements while also showing disdain for the climate problem, both popular with his base. Joe Biden was elected in 2020 and took office in 2021, and one of the very first things he did was to rejoin the Paris Agreement. He also strengthened the U.S. emissions reduction commitments. So our targets are now to reduce U.S. emissions in 2030 by 50% compared to 2005 levels, and to reach net zero emissions by 2050. That means that emissions will be close to zero, and any emissions that do occur will be balanced by carbon dioxide removal. Now, Biden has had difficulties getting his policies through Congress. So, as an example, he had a lot of emissions reduction technologies in his Build Back Better plan, but because the Senate is split 50-50, he cannot afford to have even a single Democratic senator defect. And there was one U.S. Senator, Joe Manchin from West Virginia, who voted against the policy or said he would not support it. And that essentially prevented Biden from getting those bills through Congress. So it's going to be an uphill battle to actually achieve our U.S. targets. And now, your moment of dog.